The story of rock in the 1990s is a tale of two very different vibes. On the one hand, this is the era of alt-rock and grunge, from the chaotic screaming of Nirvana to the depressive vignettes of Pearl Jam to the anxious whining of Smashing Pumpkins. It's an era of darkness, of angst, encumbered by the unbearable weight of the modern world. But it's easy to forget that at the same time, rock was also witnessing the revival of the jam band, rejecting that darkness and turning instead toward rock's origins as a music of celebration. A music of fun. With bombastic live shows and music that fused elements from other upbeat styles like country, jazz, and funk, these bands provided an alternate view of the world, one based not in pessimism and anger, but in joy. And no song captures that moment better than the Spin Doctors' Two Princes. Let's take it apart. Before we get started, if you want to see my next video a month early or just watch this one ad-free, those are both live now on Patreon. There's a link in the description, more on that at the end of the video. I'm going to do things a little different this time. Normally, I like to start these videos with the intro, then follow the song as it develops through verses, choruses, and so on. But here, I can't really do that because instead of the more typical rock approach of building a dynamic contour by moving between sections, Two Princes borrows more from the funk tradition, which likes to sit in a groove and see just how deep it goes. Put simply, most of this song is a single 2-bar loop. There's a couple bridges, but they're few and far between, and their main job is to shuttle you back into that repeating groove. So if we really want to understand how it works, we can't follow it from start to finish. We have to take this loop apart piece by piece, and like any good groove, that starts with the drums. These are played by Aaron Comas, and the first thing that strikes me is the sound itself. Specifically, that snare tone. The song is famous for its incredible snare tone, and rightly so. It might sound a little lonely in the isolated track, but in the full mix, it's got such a unique, piercing character to it, unlike anything I've heard elsewhere. And it all starts with gated reverb. This is the combination of a heavy reverb effect and a noise gate. The reverb adds a sense of space and power. But too much can make it sound washed out and interfere with other instruments in the mix. The noise gate cuts it off after a bit, so you get that massive impact on the actual drum hit, without having to manage the echoey tail that comes after. Gated reverb is like the iconic drum sound of the 80s, the engineering force behind hair metal's infamous shotgun snares. But the Two Princes snare doesn't sound like that. It's brighter, airier. The Spin Doctors, like many bands in the early 90s, were tired of that over-the-top arena rock sound, so to set himself apart, Comas used a snare from the legendary Australian drum maker Chris Brady. And that might not sound like a big deal. I mean, a snare's a snare, right? Not exactly. The height and width of the drum have a huge impact on its tone, as do the materials used for the body, the rattle, and the drum head. Cole Audio Cult has a great video about this, comparing the sounds of different snares made by different companies with different materials. If you want to know more, I'll put a link in the description, but for our purposes, we can just compare the sound of a relatively common rock snare, the Ludwig Black Beauty, with a Brady. And it's night and day. The brass shell of the Black Beauty gives it this deep, punchy tone, much like what you'd hear in those shotgun snares. It's a hit you can feel in your chest. The wood shell of the Brady, on the other hand, is much more resonant, giving it this lovely ringing quality with all these higher overtones that the Black Beauty just didn't have. It feels less like a punch and more like it's singing, with a gorgeous sustain that lifts it up out of the background position that drums so often find themselves relegated to. Now, to be clear, this is not the same model Comas played. His was smaller, which makes it even brighter. But the timbre of that wood construction is unmistakable. And that changes the impact of the gated reverb. Without that deep rumble of a metallic shell, it sounds less like a shotgun and more like crunching leaves or crinkling paper. It shimmers in the mix. Here, listen to it again. It's just gorgeous. He's also playing a bunch of ghost notes, lighter snare taps that saturate the soundscape while being too quiet to open the gate on their own. These are played in a 2-beat cycle with 5 attacks spread out as evenly as possible without breaking the 16th note pattern. and they're aligned just right to maximize rhythmic dissonance. There's a well-known, pretty comfortable rhythm in rock called a tresillo, which spreads out 3 hits as evenly as possible. And we know Comus is familiar because the tresillo comes from a popular Latin rhythm called a son clave, which is what the intro fill is based on. These snares, on the other hand, are hitting every available 16th note except the tresillo. It's like a negative tresillo, or a tresillo echo. This means there's no attack on the downbeat, the theoretically stable backbeat gets disrupted by another snare right after it, and the final pair of hits gets cut off early by the next downbeat. All the offbeat positions are filled, making a really effective engine that drives the song relentlessly forward. This rhythm also points an even larger spotlight on the big snares. The hi-hats are playing 8th notes, and the kick, well, we'll get to that in a second, but the point is every 16th note in the entire bar is occupied by at least one drum hit, except the ones right before those snares. The whole groove stops for a second, charging up energy that it releases in a massive gated reverb attack. The kick, on the other hand, has a slightly longer pattern. In the back half of each bar, it does some syncopation around beat 3, adding another layer of depth around the ghost snares. But I want to draw your attention to the beginning of the bar with these 2 8th notes. Comus plays these exact kicks in this exact rhythm at the start of nearly every bar for the entire song. I don't have anything to say about that yet, but it's going to be really important later. You may already know why, but if not, something to look forward to. After drums, the next most important part of a funk groove is the bass, but I'm going to skip that for now. It's complicated, we'll save it for last. Instead, let's look at Eric Schenkman's guitar. He's playing a pretty simple chord loop, but one I actually don't see that often. These 4 chords are kind of like the fingerprint of the major scale, and they show up together in tons of loops, including really famous ones like the doo-wop changes, or the axis progression. But what Schenkman's playing is a bit different. A while back, I coined the term cascade loop to describe a particular sort of chord loop that chains a series of small resolutions together so that as soon as you leave the one chord, you're immediately on the road back. Broadly speaking, chord motion tends to sound weak when it's moving by third and strong when it's moving by step, 4th, or 5th. A cascade loop typically kicks off with some kind of thirds, like D to B minor, then combines different kinds of strong motion until it works its way back to the starting point. It's entirely set up to emphasize the return to 1, drawing all your attention to the start of the 2-bar phrase. And what do we find there in Schenkman's guitar part? Yeah, it's that same 8th note rhythm we saw in the kick. This is starting to seem important. Unlike the others though, Schenkman gets to play 2 different versions of the loop. The first one, which we already heard, is chord-based. Each bar starts with an 8th note figure on the first chord, does a little scratching, then anticipates the beat, changing chords a 16th note early. But he only plays the low notes of the new chord to start. This gives the progression a greater sense of contour. In theory, all the chord motion here is down, with each one lower than the last. Hitting only the low strings emphasizes that motion, so you feel it falling even further, before the high strings come in as if they're leaping back up. The voicings zigzag around the harmonic motion, turning the monotonous downward slide into something bouncy and fun. But the chords are still moving down, which creates a bit of a physical problem. He's playing full 6-note voicings and just walking his hand down the neck, which mostly works because they're all pretty close together, except on the loop. At the end, he winds up on a low G chord and needs to quickly get back to the high D, so every 2-bar phrase ends with this frantic slide, scooping back up and providing yet another arrow pointing back to that all-important downbeat. His other version is more of a riff. It starts with a single note walk-up, immediately setting it apart from the full chord strums in the other pattern. Then the rest is a combination of scratching and high stabs, arranged in this cool syncopated rhythm. The higher range, along with the more staccato playing, makes this feel almost like horn stabs, punctuating the space and standing in sharp contrast to the more sustained strumming of his other part. There's also more variety here, with 2 different endings. The first time through, there's this sus chord figure that gives it a lovely little melodic conclusion, while the second replaces it with a busier syncopated strum hitting every 16th note in the bar except the ones on beats for a more rhythmic release. These two endings give it a really expressive shape, breaking free from the confines of the loop to deliver something more elegant and gestural, and as such he reserves it for a couple specific moments. In the early part of the song, he only uses it once, in the break between the first two verses where Chris Barron starts scatting. But he also brings it back for the outro, alternating between 8 bars of this and 8 bars of the chord figure to provide a bit of contrast as the rest of the band vamps. Next, let's turn to Barron's vocals.
1, 2, Princess knew before you, that's what I said now.
This 2-bar phrase makes up the majority of all the vocals in the song. Outside the bridge, every lyric he sings is set to this exact melody in basically this rhythm. You may have noticed that he starts with the exact same pair of 8th notes.
1, 2.
And yes, once we get to Mark White's bass part, he does it too. Every other bar, the entire band takes a break from syncopating to come together and play this one simple rhythmic moment in perfect unison. Shankman, Barron, and White even play it on the same note, D, the root of the key. It's a melodic, harmonic, and rhythmic breather, balancing the more intricate grooves with something immediately relatable. And that's a large part of what makes this song sound so funky. One of funk's big innovations was taking the backbeat emphasis from rock and roll and shifting it forward to land heavy on beat 1 instead. That trades a little background rhythmic excitement for a really strong anchor, establishing a clear, unambiguous, uncomplicated pulse against which everyone is free to go nuts with syncopation for the rest of the bar. It's a different rhythmic philosophy, collaboratively building grooves from the interaction between separately adventurous parts. Everyone has their own way of playing with a beat, and the entire rhythmic tapestry becomes incredibly dense and nuanced, but it's all held together by the linchpin at the start of the bar. But what is Barron actually singing? Melodically, it mostly follows the chords, walking down the scale with occasional leaps up to punctuate certain lyrics. But if we're talking syncopation, then I'm more interested in the rhythm. If after the big 1-2 figure, everyone goes off and does their own thing, what does Barron do? What's his role in this metric puzzle? Well, he's doing one of my favorite kinds of melodic syncopation, which I like to call a bounce-off. He starts on the beat, and almost all his notes are an 8th note long. But because doing all 8th notes
1, 2, Princess knew before you
sounds unbelievably square, he shortens one of them, just one, to a 16th. That pulls all the notes after it forward, shifting them off the beats and into the syncopated cracks.
1, 2, Princess knew before you.
I like this for vocals because it's simple in theory but exciting to listen to, so you can play those rhythmic games with everyone else without adding so much complexity that the lyrics become hard to follow. It's a really nuanced melody, which lets him repeat it over and over without you getting bored. And that just leaves Mark White's bass. I said this one was tricky, and it is. Of the Spin Doctors, White was the one with the biggest background in funk, and there's few things more dangerous for a music theorist than a talented funk bassist. Like Shankman, White's version of the loop is inconsistent. Unlike Shankman, though, that's not because he has multiple distinct riffs. The structure is always the same, but his playing is full of ad-libbed decorations, so every time through sounds a little bit different. But to get the easy stuff done first, let's start with that basic form. I think the simplest way to approach this is to go chord by chord. Under D major, he just plays the 1-2 figure like everyone else. For B minor, Shankman changed chords early and White follows him, emphasizing the anticipation by playing 2 pairs of syncopated 16ths on either side of the missing beat. At the end of the bar, there's another set of syncopated 16ths that play into another one of those 1-2 things for the A chord, and under the G, he walks up the scale, bringing him back to D to start again. And beyond notes, the other thing I hear is that he's swinging the 16ths. Pretty hard, actually. It's especially clear in the walk-ups, but his whole part is super laid back. On its own, you can really feel the rhythmic ebb and flow that makes swing so infectious, but it's harder to catch in the full mix because it contrasts with some of the other instruments, especially Comus's drums. There, we've got a much straighter pulse with evenly spaced 16ths throughout, and the other two fit somewhere in the middle. Shankman is closer to Comus's time feel, while Barron sits closer to White. The differences here are fractions of a second, but still, this spectrum of swing makes the whole thing feel loose and vibrant, less a polished production and more four friends jamming. It holds you in this uncertain space, not sloppy enough to fall apart, but not tight enough to sound mechanical either. It feels like it's played by humans who are just looking to have a good time, and that's where some of the best grooves live. That leaves us with the hard part. how do you analyze decorations? He didn't sit down and plan these out. He just played whatever he felt in the moment, and what that is keeps changing throughout the song. There's no obvious structure, no definite pattern. To even begin wrapping your head around his playing, you'd have to sit down and go through the bass for every single loop, one by one, for the entire song. So yeah, I did that. Of course I did. What else was I going to spend a Sunday afternoon on? But it wasn't for nothing. I figured there had to be something going on. Human beings are really bad at true randomness, and besides, White's an artist. He's not trying to be unpredictable, he's trying to sound good. I assumed that meant there'd be some logic here, some vocabulary to guide his choices, and I was right. But before I get into that, I do want to stress that as far as I know, this is ad-libbed. I couldn't find any interviews where he talks about that, but it's not consistent enough to sound planned. The structures we find may be partly intentional, but I think they're mostly intuitive. He's an experienced enough musician to have a decent sense of what works, and as he goes through it, he's letting those instincts tell his fingers what to do. We can still analyze the logic of those instincts, but I don't want to imply that this is the thought process he used to create this bass line. It's more like his understanding of musical grammar. With that said, let's crunch some numbers. There are 41 statements of the bass loop in this song. Of those, 27 start with that 1-2 figure on the D chord, 34 have the syncopated pairs under B minor, 33 have the 1-2 figure on A, and 31 have that walk up under the final G. Every single loop features at least one of those 4 devices, and a total of 18 are completely unmodified, containing all 4. What does that tell us? Very little so far, but we're just getting started. The next thing to note is that the decorations themselves aren't arbitrary. He's got a couple specific variations he likes to play, and he mixes and matches them as he goes. He's not making up a whole new line every time, he's taking a couple ideas and rearranging them in a bunch of different ways. Like, when he changes the G chord walk-up, he always does one of 2 things. The first change is practical. The bridge starts on a different chord than the loop, so for those transitions, he changes the notes to bring us there instead. On the other hand, the second change is purely decorative. Sometimes, instead of walking straight up, he adds this high leap, going up to E before settling back down. This is the highest note in the entire bass part, only ever used in decorations, and putting one at the end of a phrase gives it this beautiful rise, like a big wave lifting the song up before dropping it gently back on shore. Check it out. Princess who adore you, just go ahead now. Gorgeous. I'm going to take the B minor and A chords together because he tends to treat them as a unit. There's really only one change he makes to either of them, and anytime he does one, he does both. This starts by extending the syncopation of the B minor, so it carries over the bar line, pushing back the transition to A. It's probably the most elaborate decoration he has, not just changing notes, but challenging the underlying meter, and he never does it alone. Every time he plays this, he's also changing either the D chord or the G chord, implying that he thinks of it not just as a decoration, but as an amplifier, multiplying the impact of that other ornament. And finally, the D chord has a couple different variations, but they're all basically what you'd expect. If you're trying to decorate a pair of 8th notes, the easiest thing to do is add a 16th in between. Sometimes he drops down to B, sometimes up to E, and sometimes he does a more complex encircling figure, playing both E and B before finally returning to D. There's also this absolute barn burner in the solo section, where he accents the extended B minor with a double dip under the D chord, but that's the only time he does that. I just wanted you to hear it. So those are the pieces. What does he build with them? What are the patterns? My first theory was that, like with Schenkman's part, we'd see more elaborate stuff later in the song once the basic form has started to get repetitive. And kinda? I did a quick linear regression because I'm incapable of being normal, and there is a slight increase in decorated phrases later on, going from a little over 50% of loops in the beginning to around 60% by the end. But more important is the kind of decoration. Early loops mostly just add a simple neighbor tone on the D chord, while later loops are far more likely to do the high E walk-up and the encircling figure. The extended B minors also tend to come early, which is kinda surprising, but I guess he felt like he stopped needing it later on. My next guess was that it might have something to do with sections. Maybe he relaxes in the verses and pops off elsewhere. That turned out to be completely untrue, with one glaring exception. Almost half of the extended B minors in the entire song happen during the guitar solo. That's cool, and it tells us he was probably really vibing with Schenkman's shredding, but beyond that, this wasn't a very productive approach. Where things finally got interesting was when I started thinking about phrases. Each section is 8 bars long with 4 2-bar loops, so I grouped all the loops that came first in their section, then the second ones, and so on. I figured he might have some preferences about which decorations go in which part of the phrase, and boy does he. Loop 1 is never decorated. He starts every section with that same basic form. And that makes sense. If you never play the normal version, the decorations become the norm. The start of a new section tends to feel particularly grounded, so leaving it alone gives you a framework to hear everything else against. Loop 2, on the other hand, turns its attention to its ending. This is where he plays the high leap in the G chord walk-up. He doesn't do it on every loop 2, but he does it a lot, and importantly, he never does it anywhere else. If it's not the second loop of a section, he's not going to play this. And that, again, makes sense. The high E is the most striking decoration he has, contrasting the simple form of loop 1 with something more dynamic and fun. He's returning to that improvisational play space as he opens up the rest of the phrase. Loop 3s are fun. There are no undecorated loop 3s in the entire song. Every single one starts with some modification under the D chord. This is where all the encircling figures are, but even when he's not playing that, he's at least tossing in some sort of neighbor tone. And that makes sense. We're at the most distant point from the start of the section, as deep in the weeds as we're gonna get. Loop 2 was taking us away from normal, and loop 4 has to start bringing us back, but loop 3 can just go wild. And what better way to set yourself apart than by breaking free in literally the first beat? This is also usually following directly from the high walk-up in loop 2, so there's a bunch of extra energy that needs to be unwound here. There's a sort of handoff with the excitement of the walk-up spilling over the bar line. And loop 4 is a bit of a grab bag. About half of them are unmodified. The rest have a mix of lower neighbors on the D chord, some extended B minors, and of course this is the last loop before each of the bridges, so it's where we hear those modified transfer walks. And all of that, finally, makes sense. He's winding down, working his way back to ground. A little decoration is cool, but you don't want to come barreling into the bar line with too much steam or you'll knock it over. White is carefully balancing all his various decorations to keep the song moving without letting it stumble. Bass can be an easy instrument to overlook, but a good bassist is the rock that grooves are built on, and Mark White is holding it down. And that's pretty much it. There's a lot going on in this song, but almost all of it can be understood as jamming out on this single 2-bar pattern. Everyone has their own part to play, and each one holds down their own respective corner of the groove. Together, they overlap into something so infectious, so exciting, that it doesn't need to change. It could go on for hours, and as a jam band, that's kind of the point. In live shows, they could extend segments, playing off the energy of the crowd and taking turns riffing on the form. The simplicity of the structure allows for a lot of spontaneity in the details, creating the song fresh every time they perform it. And that, I think, is why it was such a big hit at the time, and why it still resonates today. That said, there are other parts, and while I really wanted to drill into the loop here because it felt like the song's core idea, I do still have thoughts on the drum fill, the bridge, and the solo, and I get into a lot of those in the extended cut on Patreon. Every episode I make winds up with a ton of interesting stuff that I had to cut from the script for one reason or another, and I always like to spend a little time going through my favorite details in an extra unscripted section for my Patreon supporters. It's part of how I say thanks for making this channel possible, especially these days. I also post all my new videos early over there, so if you can't wait to see what I'm talking about next, that video's already up on Patreon. There's a link, as always, in the description. And hey, thanks for watching. Thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sungard, Howard Levine, Warren Hewitt, Damian Fuller Sutherland, Neil Moore, and Jeff. Check out Patreon for a follow outro, and as always, keep on rockin'.